magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and this is the unit focus video on both Yvraine and the Visarch. In these unit focus videos, I talk about what the unit is, its role on the table, obstacles to using it effectively, and how best to play around those obstacles. Now, I generally do not do unit focus videos on multiple units, but here's what happened. I was trying to make a unit focus video on the Visarch and a unit focus video on Yvraine, and in these videos, I found myself talking about the other models so much that I figured it actually just makes more sense to do them together. Nevertheless, I'm going to start by talking about Yvraine because she's seen a lot more play in highly competitive GT lists, and then I'm going to talk about the Visarch. But I do want to say, I think the Visarch is excellent. In fact, I think the Visarch is a serious contender for the most undervalued unit in the Codex. I think it's, Index. I think it is highly competitive, and you should consider using it. If you're only here for the Visarch, I will include a timestamp in the video description so you can jump ahead to just hearing about the Visarch if you want to. But at the end, I'm going to talk about using them both in a single unit because that is an option in the rules. I'm also going to do something else a little bit different from what I usually do in this video, and that is I'm going to start off talking about lore just a little bit. Calm down, busy horse dentists who are only here for tactics. It will be less than 2 minutes. But because the Visarch and Yvraine are both named characters and they are two of the only 3 signature Ynnari models, I think it makes a little sense to provide some context for who they are. Also, the data sheets are very narratively constructed around their background. So let's just touch on it. So Yvraine is, and if you're returning to 40k after a long time away, this will all be new to you. You won't understand who these models are. So this is also good for you returning players. So Yvraine is the prophetess or prophet of the newly awakened, partially formed Eldar god of death. I'm not going to do a whole song and dance about who the Ynnari are, but they're essentially a death cult. They are a new Eldari faction that draws from Harlequins and Drukhari and Craft Worlds. Yvraine did a bunch of crazy stuff and hooked up with the Ultramarine Primarch and created sort of partially an Eldar god of death who's supposed to defeat Slaanesh. If you make Yvraine your warlord, you can run a Ynnari army and pull units not only from Craft Worlds and Harlequins, but also from Drukhari with some restrictions. This is not a video on how to play Ynnari specifically. I will make such a video at some point in the relatively near future. This is just a video about how to use Yvraine and the Visarch. The Visarch is Yvraine's bodyguard, sword-wielding, melee expert, Casey Jones from the Ninja Turtles, but an elf who follows her around and is silent and intimidating and deadly. Basically the idealized future self of every formerly incredibly awkward 12-year-old who really liked swords. Everyone respects you, you're a total badass, and you never have to say anything. The Visarch actually has kind of an interesting backstory. Surprisingly, for a long time I didn't realize this is embarrassing. For a while I didn't even realize the Visarch had a backstory beyond creepy, mysterious bodyguard. But it turns out that the Visarch started out as a Dire Avenger Exarch back when Yvraine was on Beltan and was a Dire Avenger, and the Visarch was teaching sword fighting to Yvraine. Because Dire Avengers, in addition to the Shuriken Catapults, the Exarchs run around with those Dire Swords. The Exarchs are good in melee. Side note, I actually think what would make Dire Avengers cool, when they get their own kit, I would love to see them reimagined as combination, shooty melee infantry. If they all got some version of the Dire Sword, kind of, so they could shoot and charge and also fight, and they're hybrid infantry. Currently, I don't think they really have it's hard for them to have a role. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, he's teaching her sword fighting, and he falls in love with her. And then she runs off to Kamara, and she becomes a witch, and he's brokenhearted and sad, so he follows her to Kamara and poses as an incubi and takes over an incubi shrine. martial arts master style by like killing the old master. And then they found the Ynnari together and like go on the run. I will say that as cool as that backstory is, I do find it a little bit, to use a word that the kids are using these days, or were 5 years ago, sus. Because the Visarch was a Dire Avenger Exarch, and he fell in love with Yvraine. I don't think Exarchs can fall in love. The whole notion of an Exarch is a space elf who's gone so far down the path of Cain that they're incapable of caring about anything else. My understanding is that nobody has ever come back from being an Exarch, and so it does kind of seem to contradict previous lore, but maybe we're just developing the lore. Maybe like the Visarch is the one elf that did overcome being an Exarch. I don't know. But anyway, that's the story. So the build here is that Yvraine is this like badass melee psyker who does death magic stuff, and then the Visarch is a melee specialist bodyguard. And theoretically, that's how both of these models work on the table. But actually, it's more complicated than that, right? Like, you take Yvraine first and foremost because you have to make Yvraine your warlord if you want to run Ynnari. And you get access to all of these really cool Drakari units if you do, and most notably Scourges, but there are others that are good. But in addition to providing that benefit on the table, Yvraine is a melee specialist, high damage unit that, when combined with a big blob of Harlequins, also becomes a melee tar pit unit, which is kind of interesting, and generally wants to start the game in a wave serpent. Whereas the Visarch is purely a anti-infantry damage output melee monster who I think probably also wants to lead Harlequins, but can either not start in a transport at all. I think there's a really good way to do that, or can also come out of a Falcon. The Visarch build is cheaper by a significant amount than the Yvraine build. There's also a way to combine them, and I will talk about all three of those possibilities in the rest of the video. So here we go. Let's start with Yvraine. So first off, Yvraine is kind of a Farseer. She's a twist on a Farseer, but in many ways, she's much better. She doesn't manipulate the strands of fate. She does half strands of fate. She doesn't manipulate the strands of fate, but she does have some cool psychic, quote, psychic powers, the way they work in 10th edition. And she is, in fact, a melee powerhouse. So we'll look at her data sheet. She's got a move characteristic of 8. She's toughness 3. She's got a 6-up save, not great, but she has a 4-up invuln. She has 4 wounds, leadership 6, OC 1, pretty standard fragile elf character. But she's packing, as it were. For her ranged attack weapons, she has this psychic power called the Storm of Whispers, which used to be a psychic power in the earlier editions. The Storm of Whispers is range 12, d6 plus 3 attacks, hits on 2s, only strength 2, but there's a thing. Minus 2 AP, 1 damage. But here's the thing. It's anti-infantry 2+ with devastating wounds, and it's a psychic attack. So for you newbies, what this means is it always wounds infantry on a 2, and because it has devastating wounds, it always ignores armor saves on a 2. So this means that she puts out d6 plus 3 attacks, so an average of 6 attacks that are going to hit on 2s with 1 reroll for our detachment ability, and then will wound infantry on 2-up with 1 reroll for our detachment ability, and then there will be no armor saves or invulnerable saves of any kind possible. So on average, she will just do 6 unpreventable wounds to an infantry unit with this. And this is obviously really good into infantry that's very tough or has a really good invulnerable save. So she just picks up, on average, 2 Space Marine Terminators or 2 Wraithguard. This is really powerful into durable infantry characters. And then she also has a pretty badass melee profile. She has the Sword of Sorrows, which has 5 attacks, hits on 2s, only strength 4, sad. But if she's attached to a unit of Harlequins, which is, I think, the only way to run her, she'll have +1 to wound on the charge. That's something that Harlequins bestow. So the strength 4 isn't so bad. And then -3 AP, flat 2 damage. Pretty good. So especially good into Marines. And right now we're seeing, I think one of the reasons Yvraine has been seeing so much play is that the heavy infantry meta is really strong right now. There are a lot of like Gladius Task Force, Space Marines doing really well. Grey Knights are doing really well. And this is a good profile into that kind of stuff. So she leads with her Storm of Whispers and on average does 6 mortal wounds with that. And then she charges in with her 5 attacks that are hitting on 2s, probably wounding on 3s, almost ignore armor, and then just pick up whatever 2 wound infantry failed to save. Also, it has devastating wounds. So any 6s you do roll to wound, you just push those through. And if you really had to do 2 wounds to something, you could use a fate die to make it happen automatically. And she's only 100 points. So that's a pretty solid shooting melee combo package for 100 points. She also has Deep Strike. However, you can only actually Deep Strike with her if she's not attached to a unit of Harlequins, because the way the rules work for Deep Strike, every individual model in the unit has to have the ability Deep Strike in order to Deep Strike. So you can only use the Deep Strike ability if you're running her as a singleton, and then it's a little awkward because there's no way to cheat the 9-inch thing, so you can't bring her in close enough to reliably charge something. Yes, you could use a Strands of Fate die to only need to roll like a 3 on the other die. Thered still be a 1 in 3 chance that she would fail the charge. It's not bad, and if you are running Yvraine as a singleton model, which generally is not the way to go with her, but if you are, I do think the move probably is to start her in Deep Strike, and then plan to use a fate die to auto-generate a 6 to shoot and charge with her, and maybe you keep a CP in your back pocket for a reroll if you need it. But the better move is probably to attach her to a big unit of Harlequins, and this is what most competitive players who are using Yvraine effectively in GTs are doing, possibly all of them, because she has 2 abilities that have fabulous synergy. I mean, just amazing synergy with a big unit of infantry, particularly of the things that she can lead, clowns. So she's got 2 things. Herald of Unid. I still don't really know how we're supposed to be pronouncing that. I've heard people from Games Workshop pronounce it, I think, 3 different ways. But in any event, when she's leading a unit, models in the unit have a 5-up Feel No Pain ability. Now that's pretty awesome because Harlequins already have a 4-up Invulnerable Save, the regular infantry. And so if you can stack on top of that a 5-up Feel No Pain, even though Harlequins are kind of notoriously fragile, suddenly with the Feel No Pain save, they're kind of not. And here's the trick. Harlequins also have access to the lightning fast reactions stratagem. So if Yvraine is leading a big unit of Harlequins, either 10 or 11, there's a good case for running her with 11 actually. If she's running with either 10 or 11 Harlequins and you spend 1 CP to make them -1 to hit, then most stuff hits on 3s, right? So say your opponent is attacking those Harlequins with like 40 dice, like they charge the Harlequins, they want to get in there and they have 40 like strength 5 AP -3 attacks, like it's, I don't know, a bunch of Space Marines with power fists or something. I don't know, some pretty impressive dedicated melee unit. Well, they would normally be hitting on 3s, but if you use lightning fast reactions, now they're hitting on 4s. So 20 of those attacks miss, and they're all going to wound the Harlequins on 3s, but like 6 of those attacks aren't going to wound. Now they're 14 wounds. Now they're going to save 7 times out of 14. So now they've saved 7 times and 7 attacks are going through, but now they're going to feel no pain on a 5-up. So 2 or maybe even 3, if you're lucky, of those Harlequins are not going to die. And so those like 40 strength 5 minus AP whatever attacks, like that incredibly powerful storm volume of fire melee burst, ends up killing like 4 clowns. And then she has Word of the Phoenix. While this model is leading a unit in your command phase, you can roll 1d6, and on a 2 plus d3 destroyed bodyguard models are returned to the unit. So like on average, then 2 of them stand back up in your command phase. So you probably see what's happening here. You end up with like a ton of fragile elves that are surprisingly sticky and hard to get rid of. And the damage output on Harlequins really isn't terrible. I've got a whole video on how to use Harlequin troops, or how to use Harlequins in general, how to win with them. And I have a section on troops. And if you're really interested in having her run with a bunch of Harlequins, you could listen to that video. But short version, if you run 10 of them, you can give 2 of them fusion pistols, and if you run 11, if you add 1 more clown to the unit, you can give 4 of them fusion pistols. You want to take as many fusion pistols as you can. You give the leader an Aldari power sword. Everybody else gets a Harlequin special weapon, and they put out an absolute crazy number of dice. Their attacks are not amazing like they used to be. There's no way to get to 2 damage with them. The AP is kind of like fine. The strength is fine, but they do get +1 to wound on the charge, and they do roll an enormous amount of dice. And on top of the fact that Yvraine already has a pretty good combat profile, like pretty good damage output, especially into heavy infantry, add 11 clowns in there, and this is just an absolute beat stick, especially for the kind of infantry that's doing well in the game right now. I mean, they will just pick up units. They're really good into stuff like Terminators, simply because she can go through armor with her Storm of Whispers, and then she has really good AP, and then the Harlequins just have volume of dice. The other advantage that the clowns bring to the table is they have the grenade keyword. So if you really want to get crazy with the damage output, before you have Yvraine use her shooting attack, you spend 1 CP on grenade, you roll 66, and every 4-up does a mortal wound. And then you have Yvraine shoot, and if you're close enough with the clowns, they have either 2 or 4 fusion pistols. They open up with the fusion pistols, and then you could take up to 4 neurodisruptors. Are they automatically wound infantry on a 2-up, but they have no AP, so generally you're better off just taking the Shuriken pistol. They're better into stuff like orcs, but the way the meta is, I think generally you just want Shuriken pistols. And so what you have in Yvraine with either 10 or 11 clowns is this super powerful, super powerful melee infantry elimination unit that could also take out light vehicles. That is just really sticky because they shed damage, and then you resurrect bodyguard models. One of the issues that that package faces is that it's kind of slow, right? And because Harlequins no longer advance in charge like they did in previous editions. So we've got a movement of 8 inches. It's not bad, but given how powerful it is worthwhile for your opponent to just kind of play around it if she can, and probably she can on a lot of boards and in a lot of matchups. And so what most people who are using this combo do is put it in a Wave Serpent. Now, the only issue here is it's starting to get pretty expensive. Yvraine is very competitively pointed at 100 points. If you add in the 10 Harlequins, it jumps to 265 because it's 165 for 10. If you want 11, so they're yet even more resurrectable, and it's harder to chew through the bodyguard, and they get 2 more fusion pistols. And I really don't think it's a bad idea to go to 11 if you have the points left over. Suddenly we're at 280 for the package. And if you want them to be mobile, you put them in a Wave Serpent. Now, a Wave Serpent is 120 points, which is actually quite efficiently pointed. It's 20 points cheaper than a Falcon because it doesn't have the damage output. But now we're at 400 points, right? This is now 20% of your army. And months ago, I was skeptical about this build, back when I was just thinking about ways you could try to use Yvraine. But having seen the way it's unfolded in the hands of really good players at GTs, I have to acknowledge and accept that actually it's good. And when I've run it myself, it's been good. Yes, it's a lot of points, but you can get them into the position with the Wave Serpent. Once they jump out, they're super useful. And then the Wave Serpent is a pretty durable, like objective control, secondary scoring, harassing, move blocking piece that's like just durable enough to be an issue for your opponent to eliminate and cheap enough that you don't have to really care about it. Generally, most people you default to the twin-linked Bright Lances and an underslung Shuriken Cannon. But if you know you're playing into a heavy infantry meta, it's actually not a bad idea to do the underslung Shuriken Cannon and also a twin-linked Shuriken Cannon, because you reroll, it has sustained hits, and you reroll one hit roll for the detachment ability, and then for twin-linked you reroll all of the wound rolls, which means the Shuriken Cannons are actually also pretty decent into high toughness stuff, because you're rerolling the wound roll. When you only wound on 5s or 6s, you stand a decent chance, and so it can both do some damage to a vehicle or a monster, but also be pretty effective at picking up light infantry. The big advantage to the Bright Lances is the range, and you can also use vehicle shock and drive it into stuff, right? So I think the 400 point price tag is actually not as terrible as it initially appears. And the demonstrated success of this build over and over and over again in lists that have done well at GTs is such that I think there's no room to argue with it, right? You can't be like, no, that's bad. It's not. It has been objectively demonstrated to not only be bad, but to be very good, even though there's a lot of points wrapped up in it. And therefore you have to be careful about how you play with it. So a couple obstacles to using this effectively. One is that even though it's durable, it's still, Harlequins don't really like volume of fire. What you don't want is your opponent to be able to unload on you with multiple units that put out like 40 shots but don't have any AP and are relatively low strength, like a bunch of Tyrannid Termagants. Or you don't want just like a storm of volume of low AP 1 damage shots, because it will eventually just kind of like chew through the unit. So they're not going to run out into the middle of the table. That's not what you're going to do. You probably want to play this unit on a flank and try to position it such that Yvraine and her big body of Harlequins can hit either one flank or the other and not be vulnerable to shooting from like a huge percentage of your opponent's light infantry and high volume of fire chaff models. The other thing you can do is keep them in the Wave Serpent until the second half of the game when your opponent doesn't have a whole lot left, and then they can just be like psychotically aggressive. This can be your like late game finisher unit. And if it has a transport to get it where it needs to be on the table, then their 8 inches of movement kind of like is enough to get them around. You also need to watch out for units with precision, especially units that have ways of ignoring invulnerable saves, because Yvraine's only T3 with 4 wounds. She does, while she's leading the unit, give herself the 5-up Feel No Pain ability. Once all the clowns are dead, she doesn't have it anymore because she's not leading a unit. And that will also help against snipers, but just don't be totally oblivious to the possibility that your opponent might have enough precision fire to threaten her. I definitely think that if you are planning to run Ynnari anyway, and you need to take Yvraine, it seriously bears consideration. Using this build it's probably a good idea. It might be tempting to save points by running fewer clowns, running maybe 6 clowns, and if you put them in a falcon, then they could reroll their wound rolls when they come out of it. It's not bad. It's okay. I don't suggest it though, because really the value of the resurrection ability in Herald of Ynid is the ability to create that sort of like tar pit effect, and they just don't, when you've only got 5 clowns or whatever, they don't tar pit effectively. Your opponent can wipe that out before you can resurrect anything. Now, the other thing you could do is add the Visarch to this unit. If you add the Visarch to the unit and you want to put it in a Wave Serpent, obviously you can only run 10 clowns because 12 models fit in a Wave Serpent. But I'm going to talk about that possibility at the end. And by the way, that's not something people are doing, but I actually think there's an interesting argument for doing it and possibly doing it in place of having them in a Wave Serpent. But first, let's just talk about the Visarch. So the Visarch unlike Yvraine, the Visarch is really exceptional into enemy infantry. That's really where the Visarch shines. Unlike Yvraine, the Visarch does not turn the unit he leads into some kind of melee tar pit unit. He's pure damage output. And actually, he's awesome, and he's way better than I gave him credit for when the index first dropped. So he's movement 8, toughness 3, 2-up save, which is nice. He's got that like Phoenix Lord level armor, 5 wounds instead of 4, which is good. Leadership 6, 1 OC, and his melee, he's got no shooting attacks, but wow, his melee profile rocks in combination with his special ability. So he has the Sword of Silent Screams, which has precision for character assassination, but whatever. It has 5 attacks. Doesn't sound like crazy good, but wait. Hitting on 2s, strength 5, minus 4 AP, 2 damage. So his weapon is strength 5 instead of Yvraine's strength 4, and minus 4 instead of minus 3. And minus 4 is really, really good. We're seeing a lot of 2-up saves in the meta, and being able to get to your opponent saving on a 6 instead of a 5-up actually ends up being pretty significant statistically. You're cutting their saves in half. In the 2-up meta, you need a lot of minus 4 AP. And actually what got me playing around with the Visarch was tooling my list for like a pretty severe 2-up infantry meta. And I started out just by looking at everything in the index that has a minus 4 AP. And I was like, oh, interesting, the Visarch does. And I tried a bunch of other characters too, and I was shocked at how effective the Visarch is. And this is why. So the Visarch gives whatever unit he's leading fights first, which is really good for reasons I'll go into in just a moment. And then he has Champion of Unid. Each time this model is selected to fight, select one of the abilities below, and the weapon gains it until end of phase. So it either gets sustained hits 2, generally that's what you want, devastating wounds, not bad, or lethal hits. Now, sustained hits 2 is freaking awesome because you have 5 attacks and you get 1 reroll for the detachment ability. So effectively, you're rolling 6 dice. So on average, you're going to pick up at least, because you're re-rolling 1. On average, you'll roll 1-1, which you'll re-roll, and you're rolling 6 dice total. So you're going to get at least 1 6. Generally, on average, you're going to get 1 6. So on average, this weapon with only 5 attacks is going to hit 7 times. Strength 5, so normally would be a 3-up to wound into T4 infantry, except Harlequin units, you may remember, get +1 to wound on the charge. So actually, into most heavy infantry, the Visarch is going to be wounding on 2s. So 7 hits on average, then 7 wounds with the reroll. Typically, it's going to be 7 wounds. And into stuff that's like T5, you're going to be wounding on 3s instead of 4s, which is just great. Minus 4 AP, it's just going to go straight through power armor, flat 2 damage, and you get 1 reroll to wound. So on average, the Visarch on his own will just pick up 7 Space Marines on his own with average dice. And if you get a little bit lucky, and I've had games where I've multiple rounds in a row with the Visarch gotten just a little bit lucky, and with that reroll, instead of getting 1 6, gotten 2 6s. And so if you get 2 6s, suddenly each of those 2 6s are 6 hits, and then if your 3 other dice hit, you're putting out 9 attacks, all of which are wounding on 3s with minus 4 AP with a reroll. It's like effectively like 10, doing flat 2 damage. That's crazy. He can end up picking up like 8 Space Marines on his own. If he's also leading 5 Harlequins, and I find this is the way to run him. If he's running with 5 Harlequins and the leader Harlequin has the Eldari Power Sword, which has pretty decent AP, and the Harlequins have a couple of fusion pistols, and they can also throw grenades. Remember the grenade stratagem? So you lead with whatever you're charging, taking like 3 mortal wounds. Well, the Visarch leading 5 Harlequins can wipe out a squad of like 10 Space Marines, kind of without an issue. And the Visarch leading 5 Harlequins, because the Visarch has 90 points. The Visarch leading 9 Harlequins is only, or 5 Harlequins is only 165 points. That's pretty freaking cheap, especially compared to, Yvraine's like 400 points coming out of the Wave Serpent. Now, he has the same mobility issue that Yvraine has with the 8 inches of movement. So you can choose to put him in a Falcon, and that adds 140 points to the cost of the unit, and now it's like a 305 point package, but you do get to reroll all the wound rolls, which means now the Visarch and the Harlequins are actually really good into like vehicles and monsters, and anything that's less than toughness 10 is they just menace with all the rerolls. And I have a list in which the Visarch rides around in a Falcon with the 5 Harlequins, and it hasn't let me down yet. It's good, but I do think there's a lot to be said simply for the Visarch with 5 Harlequins, 165 points, because of that Fights First ability. So here's how this build works if you want to do the more economical one, and this is what I started with, and I found it was great. You move the Visarch and his 5 Harlequins to completely out of line of sight in the midfield behind some terrain. And for the first half of the game, he's a deterrent. Because if your opponent has some sort of fast infantry that can close with you by like using breachable and running through terrain, well, they run straight into the Visarch and his 5 Harlequins. And because he has Fights First on your opponent's turn, it doesn't matter. There's no way you don't get to go first. And it's only infantry that can run through terrain. And because what the Visarch is really good into is infantry, that's a problem. Like, nothing really wants to run into that infantry unit and get wasted. And if that doesn't happen in the late game, as the board starts to get a bit safer, and you're at this point, the Visarch and the Harlequins are already positioned in the midfield. Well, now they can get aggressive. They can run through the terrain. They can run down enemy units that are objective holders. They become like a cleanup unit. And even if they don't do a ton of fighting, 165 point unit as first a deterrent and then a cleanup unit in the late game is fine. And again, the Harlequins have the grenade stratagem. So if they have to charge something like a tank or a monster, you start by throwing the grenade, you do some mortal wounds, you get in there, and you push through some damage. The flat 2 damage on the Visarch's sword is good. Just a little math here. If you're attacking anything that's less than T10, you're always best off choosing the sustained hits if you can wound on 5 up. If you're only wounding on 6s, generally you want to opt for lethal hits, because you're rolling 6 dice to hit, because you're with the Visarch, you're rolling 5 and then you're re-rolling 1 for the detachment ability. And so on average, you'll be able to push through 1 of those with lethal hits, and then when it comes time to wound, you'll have like 5 dice to wound, and on average you'll push through 1 for lethal hits, so that'll push through 2. Whereas if you were to do sustained hits and generate an average of 7 hits, you would on average only push through 1 wound with the Visarch. So generally, if the thing is T10 or greater, that's when you choose lethal hits. And then if on top of that it has a good invulnerable save, if it is T10 or greater and it has a good invulnerable save, maybe it makes sense to choose dev wounds instead. But almost all the time you choose sustained hits too. You only choose lethal hits if you're going into a really high toughness target, unless you're coming out of a Falcon. If you're coming out of a Falcon because you can re-roll the wound roll, generally you are better just going with sustained hits most of the time. Okay, obstacles to using this effectively. The biggest obstacle to using the Visarch and the Harlequin package effectively is if you come up against stuff with a 4-up invuln infantry with a good invulnerable save. Now, light infantry with a good invulnerable save, like say other Harlequins, are not a problem, because the sheer volume of attacks that the Harlequins put out will just overpower the invulnerable save. But it can be a little difficult if you're going into like a unit of 10 Space Marines, all of whom are being provided by some character with a 4-up invulnerable save. That can grind your gears a little bit. Don't get me wrong, it won't stop you. My last game with this package, over a couple turns, I chewed through one of those with this, but it can significantly slow down the damage output. So you want to lean into infantry that has a 3-up or even a 2-up save. It's fine if they have like a 5-up invuln. Like stuff like Terminators, the Visarch is really good into. But four up invulnerable saves on multi-wound tough models might give you pause. I wouldn't worry about it on fragile stuff. The other thing is you don't want to get, because the fights first thing makes you pretty robust against enemy melee, but you don't want to get caught flat-footed by enemy volume of fire. Harlequins die pretty easily to, as I was saying when I was talking about Yvraine, like just massed, like scatter lasers, for example, are just great at killing Harlequins. But anything with just no AP and volume of fire can be a real issue. So you have to be careful. If your opponent has something fast, like a bunch of bike units that have good anti-infantry fire, you want to try to position this unit a little bit later in deployment to not be vulnerable, like turn one, or think about where you want to play them into in the midfield, and then destroy enemy units that are fast enough to potentially get a good shooting angle on them. And for that reason, this build pairs well with some indirect fire units like Night Spinners or D cannons, because you can use your indirect fire weapons to destroy the whatever like fast bike units or whatever are in range to get a shooting angle. You do also have to worry a little bit about deep strikers too. But at the end of the day too, it's a 165 point unit. If in some matchups what it ends up doing is baiting out a bunch of enemy bike units that kill it and then die, like it's really not the end of the world. The other option, of course, is also to put it in the Falcon, and then you have superior durability and mobility, and they can jump out and be a menace wherever you want them to be. And that's not a bad idea either. Whether or not you're better off just sticking fire dragons in that Falcon probably depends on your meta. But I have worked out from play experience that into heavy infantry metas, it's more effective than fire dragons, and it's also more effective than banshees. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about, and possibly the edgiest possibility, is that you add the Visarch to Yvraine's. Oh no, I'm sorry. One more thing about the Visarch that you can do. If you do want to run the Visarch as a singleton 90-point melee model, a great way to do that, I have had great luck with this. If you're running the double or triple Fire Dragon Falcon build, where you have Fire Dragons and Falcons, it's a great combo. It kills like anything. One of those Falcons probably has Fire Dragons and Fugan in it, but the other Falcon or Falcons have additional seats available. The Visarch is a great sixth model for a Falcon full of Fire Dragons, a great sixth model, and it gives it tremendous depth, because the Fire Dragons don't have high enough volume of fire to be really good into heavy infantry, but the Visarch is amazing into heavy infantry, and also the Fire Dragons can throw a grenade, and together they're just like such a good package, and 90 points is just not that expensive. Sometimes people use a Troop Master as the, for the sixth spot, but for just another 35 points, you could have the Visarch, and wow, is the Visarch good. Okay, now we will talk about the last build possibility. The last build possibility is that you run a big unit of Harlequins, durable Harlequins with Yvraine, and then you also add the Visarch. You're not going to run 11 Harlequins here. You're going to run 10. This takes the entire package to 490 points, so it's like almost 25% of your army. But it does, as they say, slap, especially into heavy infantry. Oh my goodness. The Visarch and Yvraine as like a melee blender team, forget the clowns, they're going to do so much damage. Between the two of them, they can wipe out big units of heavy infantry. And the Visarch is giving the entire unit fights first, and Yvraine is resurrecting the clowns. I think this is really cool. I don't think it's necessarily it's just so many points, and I don't know that you really need the Visarch in there for the extra damage. It does make it better into like you have so much volume of attack that it does make it better into vehicles and monsters, but like I don't know, that's a lot of points. One option that I do think you have that we haven't seen people do in the tournament scene really, but I don't think it's a bad idea to make it affordable, is to lose the Wave Serpent and add the Visarch in and do exactly what I was suggesting you do with the Visarch and his smaller squad of Harlequins on turn 1 with Yvraine and the Visarch in 10 Harlequins, where you move them behind cover to the midfield, and they're ready to sweep in and be this melee tar pit unit and a cleanup unit and beat stick in the late game. That screens the rest of your backfield army, because anything that tries to charge into them, well, they're going to fight first. They're going to do a ton of damage, and that combo, if you run it with 10 Harlequins, Yvraine, and the Visarch, is 355 points, which is about the same as the Avatar of Cain, and is kind of functioning in a somewhat similar role. The Avatar is crazy durable if you throw Fortune on it. But this unit is crazy durable too, especially if you use Lightning fast for the reasons we already went into. And it's not like your opponent can light it up with I don't know, a couple of D cannons or something that would potentially pose a threat to the Avatar of Cain, because it's between the invulnerable saves and the feel no pains and the fact that you can only kill one model at a time, it's just really hard to deal with. I'm not proposing that this is a better tool than the Avatar of Cain, but it's a good one. And if you are making Yvraine your warlord and you are playing Ynnari, and you're looking for an alternative to the Wave Serpent build, I don't think that this is terrible. I don't think it's even close to terrible. I think it's actually quite good. But this last one is largely a hypothetical. This is, unlike all of the other builds I've talked about, this is not one that I've played around with, and we haven't seen anybody use it in successful tournament lists. So it's conjecture, but I think it's reasonably well founded. It is a little bit of a meta pick against armies that are highly mobile or have really good indirect fire. Maybe it would become a little bit of a target, but even then, again, with all of the damage mitigation and the fact that your opponent has to expose themselves to try to target the unit, even then, I'm not sure if it would really have bad matchups. So that's what I've got. Both Yvraine and the Visarch are really good. And if you are planning to run Ynnari and you're trying to figure out how to use Yvraine, there's a build for that, and there's a proven way to do it that's really effective. And if you have the Visarch and you love the model, and you just like stuff that's like unusual and off meta, I really think the Visarch has play. There are builds for that. And both of these models, I think, are they're kind of enough outside the norm right now that it could be fun to get them out at your local club. It's kind of like a different Eldar identity. I do just want to briefly address the other, because they're diverse leaders, right? I want to briefly address the other units that they could lead. I am convinced that in general you want the Harlequins, largely for the 4-up invulnerable save, right? They're kind of ablative wounds and a trigger for fights first for the Visarch. And for Yvraine, you're literally trying to create a tar pit, and of all of the options, these are the only ones with an invulnerable save. Everything else dies easily. When my very first build with the Visarch, actually, I ran it with Corsair Voidscarred, because I was focusing on the notion of like an anti-heavy armor meta, and the each Voidscarred has 3 attacks with a weapon that has -3 AP, and that's really good. But what I found was they die to a stiff breeze, and it was really the Visarch that was doing the killing anyway. And so the Harlequin troop just ended up being more efficiently pointed. And that grenade stratagem on the Harlequin troop too, like really, it's good. Guardian Defenders for both of these, hard no. Because Guardian Defenders are a shooting unit, and both of these are melee units. There's no synergy. They don't play well together. Cavalry Warriors are cheap. They've got like an anti-infantry trigger. They're not bad. They're fine. They're not melee units though. You're better off with the troop. The Storm Guardians, it is cool that you can take the fusion guns. It is cool that they have a 5-up invulnerable save against shooting with the platform. That's cool. It's not bad. But the troop is just better in melee. I don't think and sticky objectives are good. I think you could kind of do the Storm Guardian thing maybe, but the +1 to charge that you get from the troop and the better melee weapons, the troop is the better pick. Witches have the same issue. They're much more efficiently pointed than they used to be, but nothing really compares, I don't think, to the Harlequin troop, just for durability and also, frankly, for melee damage output. And these are both melee units, and so that's what you want. The last thing I meant to touch on earlier that I'll just talk about for a moment now, one of the primary competitors for these units in the anti-infantry role, especially for the Visarch, because the Visarch is a bit cheaper, is the Solitaire, who's a bit more expensive at, I think, 115 points, but doesn't need to run around with anybody. The Solitaire puts out 9, can advance and charge, and can blitz once per game, which lets it make a normal move of 12 plus 2d6 and then add 3 to its attack characteristic. Its normal attack characteristic is 9, hitting on 2, strength 6, minus 2 AP, flat 2. You can get that to 12 attacks with the blitz. Now, the Solitaire is good and also has lone operative and has appeared in some successful tournament lists. There's 2 issues with the Solitaire. One is, although it's really quick, it is fragile. It only has 3 wounds. It's somewhat protected by lone operative, but it really doesn't like flamers. You've got to be careful of highly mobile enemy units. It does fights first, so you don't have to worry about getting caught flat-footed, but it can be killed more easily. And then the fact that the AP on the Solitaire is only -2 instead of -4 or -3 is significant in a meta that's seen a ton of heavy armor, especially on infantry. Also, the fact that the Visarch has that special ability means that even though 9 attacks looks like a lot more than 5, in practice, the Visarch is hitting 7 times, which ends up being a whole lot like having 9 attacks, but with better AP. The Solitaire doesn't need to run around with Harlequins, but also doesn't benefit from the extra attacks. To simplify, at 115 points, for only 115 points, the Solitaire is good. It's a good pick. But for straight up killing power, you pay a little bit more for the Visarch and the Bodyguard, or Yvraine and the Bodyguard, but you get proportionally more damage output. The Solitaire has more maneuverability. They're just doing different jobs, right? The Solitaire is really fast, really maneuverable, and is going to clean up something that's unprotected, that's not as durable or tough or aggressive as the kinds of things that these other packages can take out. So they might appear to be doing similar jobs because they're both good at heavy infantry elimination, but really they're filling different niches. Okay, so that's what I've got. If you liked this video, I hope that you will click like. If you have not left a comment, I hope you will leave a comment and tell me about your ideas for using these units or other stuff. You could just tell me the name of your pet or the weirdest thing that ever happened to you in middle school. That's cool too, and it helps my algorithm. If you're feeling generous and you would like to become a patron, I would also appreciate that. The cheapest level is only $3 a month. It really helps me out. And you get to join my Discord and get early access to content and chat about all sorts of things on the off-topic channel on the Discord. And lastly, a big thank you to my patrons and also my sponsor, the Magnet Baron, who remains awesome. Thank you, Constantine. Take care, everyone. Bye. Best of luck in your next campaign.